Today we're featuring Peter and Gordon. Were they one-hit wonders with a Beatle connection, or were they British invasion innovators? Find out here on Pop Goes the 60s. So Peter and Gordon came over in the first British invasion wave in the wake of the Beatles, and they were popular right away because they were the next British band after the Beatles to have a #1 song, and they had that hit with a leftover Lennon-McCartney track called A World Without Love. So Peter and Gordon met at Westminster, and Gordon Waller was kind of a rock and roll guy, and Peter Asher was a jazz guy, and they started to go out as a duo in the folk clubs and sing with their guitars. And Asher was kind of converted into rock, but they did traditional music, traditional folk. And Peter Asher was a little bit known because he was a child TV star and did some theater. His sister Jane Asher was also in theater, and little sister Claire. So he had some connections that way. His parents were well-to-do. His father was a psychiatrist who discovered Munchausen syndrome, and his mother was a professor of music who coincidentally taught George Martin, the Beatles producer, oboe at one point when he was young. So anyway, Peter and Gordon were hitting the coffee shops, and the Beatles had hit, so people were out looking to sign people up. And EMI signed Peter and Gordon, thinking to position them as the answer to American folk music. Also at that time, Paul McCartney started dating Jane Asher, Peter's younger sister, and they started dating in October of 1963. And it wasn't that long after they began dating that the Beatles were living in London. Paul McCartney moved into Jane's parents' house with her and stayed in like the attic room. So Peter got to know Paul pretty well, and Paul had this song that he had around that had never finished. It was A World Without Love. So Peter was on him. He asked him, can we use that song? He said, yeah, we can use it. And Peter kept harping on him to finish the song. And Paul finally finished it. He kind of went off into a little room for a few minutes and finished the middle, came back and played it for him. And then when Peter and Gordon recorded that in the first recording session, they knew that was going to be the single. So it's kind of nice that Peter Asher had a Beatle living in his house there. I don't know if he was actually living there at the time, but he certainly was there enough that he got to know Paul McCartney pretty well. And once Peter and Gordon got their recording contract, they did some touring with the Beatles, so they were hanging with the Beatles. They knew them. Now Peter, as I said before, Peter and Gordon both played guitar. They weren't super musical though. Gordon Waller was basically the lead vocalist and Peter Asher was the harmony vocalist. There were instruments around the house. And one story that most people know, most Beatle fans know, is the basement music room where the piano was. It was an upright piano. That's where John Lennon and Paul McCartney wrote I Want to Hold Your Hand. And it was finished, and they called Peter down. Peter was the first person to hear that song. Now, had Paul McCartney not dated Jane Asher, would Peter and Gordon ever exist? I mean, probably not. I mean, how fortuitous was that for Peter Asher to have his sister be dating Paul McCartney? Not only to get the connection, but then for him to give them a song. So they went to the studio and they recorded their first album. Guess what the title is? A World Without Love. And this album, you could tell that they were trying to make them into a little bit of a folk singers, because this album does have some folk songs on it, like 500 Miles, Pretty Mary, All My Trials. But they also have some pop songs on here as well, and some bluesier stuff. So they were kind of all over the map on this one. So they do have one song here that they actually wrote called If I Were You. And that's actually a pretty good song. So they were given the opportunity, and that was actually put on the B-side of A World Without Love. So they got a little publishing off that, which is kind of nice. So the next album, you know, they wanted a follow-up hit, and they were on tour, and Paul McCartney already had the follow-up hit written for them. Because I think Lennon and McCartney already knew by this time, once you have it, you got to follow it up with something. So the follow-up was I Don't Want to See You Again. Not as good as A World Without Love. Not good enough for the Beatles to record, but not a bad song. So this is the second U.S. album. And by the way, they also recorded on Capitol, the same label that the Beatles recorded on and are distributed in the United States. Now this album has another Beatle, or another Lennon McCartney song called Nobody I Know. Not bad, that was the third single. And these were all hits in America, not as big as A World Without Love. But this album, they continued to explore some folk songs and some traditional songs. So this album also features 3 original songs by Peter and Gordon, which are pretty good. The liner notes on the back say that they've got their two pair of chart toppers, these 2 new Lennon McCartney songs. They didn't actually top the charts like the former song, World Without Love. They charted at 12 and 16 respectively, which is good, but they didn't top the chart. So they're already kind of trending downward. Next album, they went away from the Lennon-McCartney formula and came up with the hit, I Go to Pieces. This was written by Del Shannon, and Peter Asher feels this is their best song, the best song they ever covered. And this is a great song, and better than the 2 previous singles. This song charted at number 9, and well deserving of the top 10. This is also a mishmash album of some bluesy stuff. They do All Shook Up. You know, they're trying to do a little bit of folk stuff. And they really have not defined, I don't think, a sound for themselves other than kind of a soft rock sound. At the time, I guess we would call this easy listening. Next album, True Love Ways. What have we got here? To Know You Is to Love You. Okay, True Love Ways was a hit. And by this time, this came out in 1965, and they were still riding the British invasion wave, and it was still pretty lucrative. The records weren't as memorable as some of the earlier ones, but they were still having some hits. For instance, True Love Ways, that was a Buddy Holly song. That was a bigger hit in England. That was number 2 in England and number 14 in the States. For some reason, the Everly Brother covers and the Buddy Holly covers charted better in England than here, and then I think the British, like the Lennon McCartney stuff, charted better in the States than in England. So this album is more of the same. Now, I think in an effort to carve out a sound for themselves that was unique, they did this next album, still in 1965 here. Peter and Gordon sing and play the hits of Nashville, Tennessee. Now, I can't think of a worse direction to go. I mean, these guys cannot pull off Nashville. This whole album, I can't find a good song on here that I like. There was no single from this album either, from what I can tell. And I think they're just going full-bore adult contemporary with this. I don't know how this charted, but it probably charted respectively, even though it didn't have a single to support it. But I hate this album. And great cover on the photo, on the front though, I like that. The liner notes state, this album demonstrates once and for all the universal appeal of superior songs coupled with outstanding performances. Now, they're clearly trying to carve out a niche for these guys. And the problem is that they say outstanding performance. Peter and Gordon weren't that talented. They weren't great rock singers. They didn't have great voices. They didn't write a lot of their own material. So to stick them in a Nashville vein, it just doesn't work. Thankfully, they made a switch with the next album, which is Woman. Now, this album is from early 1966, and they went back to the Beatle formula. Woman was another leftover song the Beatles did not use, and instead of putting the Lennon-McCartney name on it, they used a pseudonym, because Paul McCartney thought, well, can we have hits without our names on it? So the name that's on the label is called Bernard Webb, and it was a hit. And this got to, what did this get to here? This got to number 14 here in the States, number 28 in the UK, and is probably considered their second or third biggest hit. And it's a good song, very good song, and it's the only Lennon-McCartney song they did on this album. Now this album, for me, is their finest moment. This is their best album, and the reason it's the best album is they kind of picked a direction. Aside from the song Woman, which is very, it's kind of Beatle-y, they did more film songs, film score songs. So some of those that they did were Green Leaves of Summer, High Noon, 3:10 to Yuma, which were two westerns, and Somewhere from West Side Story. All these songs really work well with them. They really found, I think, their niche here. And the problem with that niche is it's easy listening. It's kind of crossover. It's outside of the rock music realm. So, but it worked, and this record sold well. Next record, Lady Godiva. So, what I said earlier about them scoring well with these film songs, they didn't stick with that for this. They went in yet another direction. So they didn't go with a Beatles song. So the song Lady Godiva is a little more, not a novelty song, but a little British cheeky music, kind of like I Am Henry VIII, I Am, or Mrs. Brown, You Got a Lovely Daughter by Herman's Hermits. Lady Godiva is more like that. And it's a song that's going to do better in the States than in England. So they're playing to an American audience with this record. And that song was a hit, a hit. It got to number 6. So it's quite a sizable hit. And the rest of this album is a hodgepodge. They did do another Beatles song here. They did the song If I Fell. Now, If I Fell is from the Hard Day's Night soundtrack. Great song. Peter Asher goes solo on this one, and it's bad. I mean, it's a really bad cover. I mean, as Beatle covers go, this is one of the worst ones I've heard. So they still are not hitting. They just can't seem to find, once they get a direction, they find something good, they don't stick with it. Now, one song on here that I do want to bring up is a song called Morning's Calling. This is their most acclaimed voyage into folk rock. They wrote this themselves, and it's a really great song. So I highly suggest picking up this album. And you can see they went with a girl cover. They always had themselves on the cover, except for this one. The girl covers were really trendy at that time, like Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass, the famous Whipped Cream cover. Love girl covers. Can't go wrong with a girl cover. Okay, next album. We're getting into early 1967 here. So Lady Godiva was a hit. They continued that trend with Knight in Rusty Armor, which is kind of another cheeky British song. And this one got to number 15, so this one hit well here in the States. Didn't chart in UK. Pretty good song, but in 1967, things were getting a little more serious. And you had bands like The Doors coming out, Jefferson Airplane, the Beatles had to transition with Revolver. They're doing cheeky British stuff. In hindsight, you can tell where this is going. Even though this was a hit, this is probably not going to last long for them. Nonetheless, this album is not bad. They did do a credible cover of Homeward Bound by Simon & Garfunkel on this record. All right, so the next album is called In London for Tea. Now, we are firmly in 1967 here. And you can tell at this point they're going for the Carnaby Street feel, Sway in London, which is a good move. I mean, that produced some good music, actually. It was a good subject matter for music. The Stones were doing it, Herman's Hermits were doing it, a lot of bands, the Kinks. So this record it's uneven like the rest of them. I mean, the very, very good song here is called London at Night. And that has that whole Carnaby Street feel. That song was written by Cat Stevens. And it didn't hit for them. It wasn't a single, but I would say it's the best song on this record. At this point, they weren't really having any more hits. A couple songs on here that they recorded, Goodbye My Love and Stop, Look and Listen, were songs done by the Searchers and the Mindbenders. So this tells me they're trying to pad this album. They didn't have material, and I don't know why they chose songs that were done by other bands already, but they did. So they did a couple of cover versions here, Sally Go Round the Roses and I'm Your Puppet. Not good moves. It's too bad they couldn't continue and choose good songs like the Cat Stevens songs called London at Night, but they didn't. So their last album was in 1968. It's called Hot, Cold, and Custard. Now this is their psychedelic album. And obviously everybody was doing something psychedelic after Sgt. Pepper, and I was excited to get this album because I thought Oftentimes I find bands were able to make the transition somewhat and have a couple good songs here or there. Peter and Gordon, to their credit, wrote this whole album for the most part, and it's pretty well written, pretty well produced, but the songs are a little weak. There are two really good songs on here. One is 'Cause You're a Star, and the other one is Never Ever. Those are my favorite songs on here. Not essential listening, but not bad. But this wasn't a hit, and it wasn't critically acclaimed either. So the writing was on the wall for them. At this point, Peter Asher, this was in 1968, he still kept his connection with the Beatles and was working at Apple. He was hired as an A&R man. And he was the guy that brought James Taylor to Apple and signed James Taylor. And he subsequently left Apple, went back to the States with Taylor, and then also signed Linda Ronstadt. So that's what he was doing. Gordon Waller was releasing some singles in 67 and 68, solo singles, none of which were hits, none of which are any good, except for Rosecrans Boulevard, which I like. And then finally, after Hot, Cold, and Custard came on in 68, they did one last single together in 69 that it didn't chart. And it's okay, but it was a last-ditch effort to maybe have a hit. So that was pretty much the end of Peter and Gordon. The one album I didn't show you was a best-of album that came out in 1966 that had the usual suspects on it. If you were to get your first Peter and Gordon album, maybe that's where you'd start. I don't have that one. Maybe I'll pick that one up someday. So to answer the question I posed at the beginning of the video, are Peter and Gordon a one-hit wonder with a Beatle connection, or are they British innovators? Well, in my opinion, they are not innovators. In fact, they never were able to get past the label of British invasion group, and that carried with them to this day, really. Now, having said that, I still think there's a lot of great stuff in these 10 albums. They actually, for any group to be around from 64 to 68 and to produce 10 albums is impressive. And though they are known only as a British invasion group, they really try a lot of different things. Some hits, some misses. Some very good gems are there. So there's another video coming up that will go into some of those songs. Be sure to check out that one here on Pop Goes the 60s.